Well, Robert, thank you so much for joining me here today. And, we have a similar background in terms of our traditional sports background and then working in esports as well. And I know you also have a master's in sports psychology. So just want to have you start off and tell us a little bit about your unique path from traditional sports to sports psychology and into esports.
Awesome. Yeah, great to be on the show, by the way. Thanks for the invite. Really appreciate it. So my path is kind of similar to most people's path into traditional sports, right? You grow up loving sport, you play it, you want to get involved in teams, you dream about like coaching or working with in my case, the Irish team or the Munster rugby team or something, the most important teams in your locale. And I started off wanting to be a PE teacher. So I wanted to get into high school teaching. I wanted to be the guy who would be running the kids around and giving them the football, the basketball. And honestly, I love working with kids. So for me, ever since I was really young, this is what I wanted to do. And I ended up going over to England to study for that. So my undergrad is in physical education. And what I found that a large pathway or modules in this were on sports science, sports psychology, sports coaching, not just teaching. And I really, really enjoyed those modules. Like I really thought to myself, like, these are really interesting. And the more I got into it, I just started picking up the electives from more lab work, more sports science work. And it's not that teaching left me, but I was like, you know what? I could probably be a better teacher with more life experience. That was how I validated it to myself. So I started like getting involved in sports coaching, doing coaching badges like in hockey and soccer. And then I was like, okay, I really like this. I think I can make a career out of it, or I can follow my passion for this. And I started looking at how I can be working with sports teams. And I did a NSTA strength and conditioning accreditation. And I was like, okay, I really enjoyed this part because I'm actually working with athletes, with teams. And for some reason, they're opening up to me. They're telling me a lot of things. And I think a lot of athletes, for some reasons, like sitting down to your barber or your hairdresser, you just tell the person something, your bartender, you tell them about your life. And I'm hearing about all of these problems that they're having with teammates and coaching staff and everything, even stuff at home. And I'm like, okay, there's something else that's missing from this. And that's where the sports psychology part came into play. And I was like, okay, this is like the final or the next feather in my cap. And I did my master's in that as well. And I really kind of fell in love with the idea of psychology, the idea of people, everyone being different, and how we can make a small change in someone's life that has such a big impact. And that kind of like randomly brought me into esports. A friend of mine said, listen, esports is blowing up. It's really huge. You should check out MLG. After about 6 or 7 months of him nagging me, I was like, okay, I'll watch it. So I watched it and I was like, holy crap, like these guys are under the same stresses as traditional sports athletes. They're doing similar, if not way more volume-wise training. And I think I want to get involved in this, but I waited. Like I ingested every tournament, every stream, every talk show I could for about 9 months. And then I reached out to Team Liquid and I started working with one of their players. And that's how I kind of fell awkwardly into esports, but kind of fell in love with it at the same time.
Yeah, very cool. And I always think that working with companies and corporate environments and kind of like going from traditional sports to esports, it's all transferable. Like everybody is dealing in high pressure situations. You're dealing on teams. Talk about some of the kind of things that stood out to you in your early work as you were kind of getting into the esports space.
Yeah, so yourself when working with esports teams, you kind of go in with all your traditional sports background, and esports is the wild west, so they're kind of inexperienced, right? So you're going in thinking, okay, this is wrong, this could be better, we could optimize this, and there's so much to change. So I just took a step back when I came in. I was like, okay, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? What have you tried? What didn't work? What did work? What are you completely against? And there was a small cultural gap, right, from esports. When you go into a different sport, there are some things. If you look at like the extreme sports and whatnot, they're a lot more loose. They're a lot more kind of like play it on field, things like this. And I think like when you're in esports, some of the things that I kind of noticed were that the players were actually surprisingly very receptive towards psychology and new ideas because they're looking for that kind of like level up potential. They're looking for a way to improve their game, to get ahead, because it's very, very competitive. There's so few professional esports slots available that statistically it's easier to be an NFL athlete or NBA athlete than it is to be a esports athlete. There's only 50 in each major region, and the player base is actually quite big. So for me, like going into it, it's just a bunch of kids that were doing what they loved and didn't quite have that guidance. Like I think I was one of the first people to get involved in esports from a psychology point of view. So when I came in, I didn't have a problem like getting people to buy into what I was doing. They would just be like, okay, let's try it, let's do it. And they would do it straight away. And sometimes, because obviously I'm plying my trade within esports for the first time, I'm making mistakes. I'm like, does this work? Should it work? Let's try it. Let's see. I'm not really sure, but it's trial and error, right? And like you said about the business background and sports background, pressure and stress, like, and the effect that has on people, it's the same. It's universal. So even though they're playing video games, you're still dealing with the humanistic element of everything.
Yeah, and it's I think it's interesting because when I first got into esports, one of the things that really struck me was, like you just mentioned, being so open to wanting to perform at their best and being willing to try new things. And I think that's one thing that really stood out to me, where I think in my traditional sports background, especially football, like there's a very old school mentality where we've done it like this for a long time and this was successful 30 years ago. And I think maybe it has to do with the youth in esports, but they seem very open to trying new things and experimenting with new ideas. I'm curious for you, was there anything that maybe changed your mind about working with esports and that experience that maybe made you learn something different, or maybe that kind of changed your perspective on something that you carried with you from your traditional sports background?
Yeah, I guess this is something that you would be familiar with as well. Like if you're working with pro athletes in traditional sports, they've been conditioned to work with coaches to understand what drilling is, what practice is, how important the physical side is for sure. Maybe not so much the psychological, but as you go up into the professional kind of leagues, they understand how important everything is. But for esports, it's interesting because they haven't had that conditioning. So they haven't had to work with coaches, right? They've been working by themselves, basically individual. So everything that they've learned and everything they've improved upon has kind of been through themselves and through self-learning, like observing the best player in the world and going like, what does he do? Why does he do it? I guess I'll just copy him because he's the best, right? So they got to where they are, which is, I guess they're given a pro contract straight out of high school or out of the solo queue ladder, which is the amateur kind of ladder. And they're told, okay, now you're a professional player. And then suddenly they have to act professional and try to do the things that a professional should be doing. But it's not necessarily the case. Like you said, they're still young kids that aren't quite sure maybe how they got there, but they do know that they're good at the video game and they're still young. So they have a lot more growth and improving to do. And I remember like when I came into the scene, we weren't even allowed coaches in 2014, I think. I think maybe the first coach came in around 2015. So they were mandated, I think maybe 15 or 16. And then we've only been coaching for 5, 6, 7 years at most in esports for the most part, like professionally. So I find that kind of like staggering that we've come so far in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, and you mentioned specifically the coaching aspect, and guys that have had a lot of success up into a certain point, really reaching the highest levels without having a coach. And then all of a sudden being thrust into a situation where they're being held accountable and people are telling them what they're doing wrong, obviously can be combustible at times. And I think this goes back to kind of the soft skills. This is big in traditional sports too, right? Doing the evaluation and not just looking at the video or the film or the stats, but also trying to dig deeper and understand the person. And I know this is a lot of your work in terms of soft skills. And so I just want to hear, what are some of like the biggest challenges you face in your role as a performance coach and working with teams in terms of either like barriers that are put up in developing those soft skills, or just kind of trying to teach them to teams and players and emphasize how important they are?
Yeah, I think it all goes back to, let's say, a needs requirement or needs analysis of like what are these players lacking? What do they need in order to perform really, really well, right? And for me, I think environment is really important. So we'll talk about culture obviously a little bit later on, but the environment itself, if you're working on soft skills with players, if you're working on kind of improving some intangibles that maybe players themselves or coaches don't view as like super important, but they have a huge effect on the success of a video game or their career even. It's important that you kind of recognize that if you put them back into an environment where they're maybe feel like their job safety is under fire, or maybe they don't feel comfortable coming out of their comfort zone, like whether it's like developing relationships, becoming more confident, working on communication, like it's important that there's buy-in from everyone for this, right? So if you want to improve on someone's confidence, it's no good sending him into a situation where he's constantly being ridiculed or like beaten on because he's making mistakes. And I think that like for people like this, it's a solo adventure. So they got to where they were playing in their bedroom and getting really good at the video game before being picked up. And then they get picked up and then suddenly they have to work in a team-based environment. So number one, they're working with a coach maybe who's like never coached before, like if this is years ago, and you're working with 4 new teammates and you're expected to play at your, I guess, comfort level that you would have played in your bedroom, but it's so new. I think there was a couple of cases of players who maybe struggled with the social aspect, who struggled with the, I guess, like building relationships aspect. So they're very good at, playing the video game, pressing buttons, but they struggled with kind of showing that on stage. They didn't really know how to deal with the pressure. So there's a scrim player, which is a practice player, and then there's like a stage player, which is like a official game player. And sometimes players didn't translate the practice form into competitive form, and they'd be known as like chokers, or they're just a scrim player, et cetera, et cetera. And it's difficult to kind of bridge that gap. So in a certain way, it's like, if you've worked with a player yourself, who's maybe has a lot of potential but isn't able to show it on the big stage, it's more difficult in esports as well, because there's no 5-year contract, there's no 4-year contract. You're kind of stuck on, okay, do as well as you can for 6 months, then we will reevaluate, because it's kind of like shuffling the deck. It's like there's no continuity, there's no longevity in esports. It's about kind of instant results, because I think it's different in traditional sports, because you can directly contact an esports athlete and throw your vitriol at them and just be like, you suck, you're terrible, like you should retire. And it goes directly into their inbox. And 99 times out of 100, it's the player that's reading that, not some PR person, right? So there's never been a more close connection with fans and obviously the positive, negative feedback that comes with that than there is in esports right now.
Yeah. And what types of things have you done to kind of like work with teams and players on that? Because I think you hit on a thing that's really important in terms of the environment and obviously being at your peak performance during the most important time, the competition. Like, what have you seen that's worked with some of the teams that you've worked with in terms of like getting them to step their game up?
I think a lot of the things that I did years ago, teams are kind of realizing are important. I would say that teams are maybe practicing these things maybe with less intent than they should. So they're like, okay, we'll do a boot camp, we'll do team bonding sessions, we'll do this and that. And they're doing activities because they feel like it's going to improve relationships between players. And while that's important, I think there's something to be said about not just going through the motions and not just getting the players in a circle to talk about like some experiences. Sometimes the most visceral experiences and emotions are shared like in the heat of during a practice, right, where things are going kind of crazy, or you're losing or whatever, and you're able to, I guess, like comfortably share and safely share how you feel about things, your emotions and your thoughts, without fear of people holding a grudge or holding it against you. And I think like that kind of dynamic, I guess, like man management, and I think man management is huge the higher up you go, is something that isn't like something you're born with. There are some coaches that have that just ingrained in them, but they weren't born like that. They kind of developed that. And I'd like to think that that's like a soft skill that we can help teach the younger esports coaches, like how to deal with players, how to communicate, not just X's and O's, not just how to play the game, but how to actually work with players. Because I think you'll find like the higher up you go, which is mirrored completely with traditional sports, you're not teaching these guys theoretically how to play the game and click buttons. You're teaching them how to work with each other, how to be the best teammate that they can be, because usually the guys in the top teams have been playing for a long time or have a very high skill level. And the hardest part is just making sure that they perform as a 5-man unit in the case of like a 5-man team. And I think like that part is kind of overshadowed. Sometimes with sports psychology, we're kind of brought in to like fix problems. But I think even a high functioning team could benefit very much from working with a sports psychologist or working with a different, let's say, holistic practitioner, because there's always room for improvement. And sometimes when you're winning, it doesn't mean you're doing everything correctly, but also when you're losing, it doesn't mean you're doing everything poorly. So we have to work out what's actually working and why it's working. Are we winning because we're better, or are we winning because we're doing things better?
Yeah, so you hit on multiple things that I could literally spend the rest of our time together talking on. You see it in traditional sports. The best teams are the ones that are always kind of trying to continue to improve and look for new ways to kind of like inject maybe something different into their team. Even like the New England Patriots during their 20-year run, they're winning Super Bowls and they're going out and they're hiring a character coach to like work with
Yep.
the players, right? And they're at the very top of their sport. And you hit on something else that I have been really kind of like focusing on, which is the relationship aspect, right? And I think as leaders, that's a really important thing to understand. And really, before you get into the actual communication part and teaching the game, it all has to start with those relationships. And I think that may be one thing in terms of the youth in esports, particularly at the coaching ranks, that maybe lacks is maybe not a full understanding of how important those relationships are. And I know that you had told me before that you had kind of progressed in your time working with esports teams, working with players, and then kind of like gradually being gravitated towards working with those coaches. So talk about that a little bit in terms of kind of like that transition from focused on the players to like being more focused on the actual leadership of those teams.
Yeah. So coming into a team, I guess like the organization is like, okay, we'll bring in a sports psych, we'll bring in a behavioral specialist, and they're going to help make the team better. I think depending on which organization or team you talk with, they're going to have a different, I guess, read on what actually we do or what we should be doing with the team. And they'll have different experiences. And it's very much akin to like picking up a personal trainer. Like every personal trainer is going to have their own different style, like different accreditation. They're going to know things about exercise, but the way they, I guess, like exercise their knowledge, like their kind of like their demeanor and everything else, their style is going to be different. And that's the same for a sports. Like you can bring in someone who's very heavily based on like research science questionnaires and doing things like this, and you can bring in someone who is very much focused on just doing one-on-ones. There's not a lot of like a paper trail, and then someone who's like very heady, who's like maybe very involved in how the game is played because they have a lot of game knowledge. And I think it kind of differs, and you have to know what you're looking for. And when I go into a team, like I said, the first part is like observation, trying to figure out like who's who, what are the roles within the team, what's the hierarchy, potential problems, like seeing people kind of like in a normal honeymoon state when you join a team where they're all trying to play nice, and then see what happens when you start losing. That's like really interesting. And then see what happens like when you're winning, as like, is someone sharing praise? Is someone like kind of like puffing up their chest and like taking all of it themselves? Like things like this are like very interesting when you go into a new team. But the coaching staff themselves, like I'm a huge like believer in the fact that it's a collaborative kind of like investment. It's like everyone working together. I'm not a huge fan of like, we have role clarity for sure, but not a huge fan of like, this is your job, I don't want to have to know anything about it, you should be able to do your job without any of my help. Because in a sports team, there's going to be a lot of crossover. There's going to be a lot of situations where one person's, I guess, job or role can help the effectiveness of another person. And I think any more added information that you can have uh, will surely help you in your job as well. So I think like different perspectives are going to lead to less of a siloed mentality when it comes to like problem solving as well. So for me, I love hearing about the opinion from the GM, the manager, the coach, the cook, like everyone. Like, tell me what you see, tell me what you hear, because I've gotten so many good insights from when I was on Misfits from our chef, because the players will go into him and they tell him stuff, and then not that he would squeal to me, but he'd just be like, hey, you should keep an eye on this guy, maybe he's not feeling too good. And I'm like, oh, that's great to know. And it would be horrible of me just to be like, oh, you're just a chef, like, what do you know? I'm like, I love hearing it because I think it's really helpful. And that's kind of what I try and instill in people, is that like, as leaders of the group, we're setting the example. If we turn up late, the players know it's okay to turn up late. If we eat junk food, the players think it's okay to eat junk food. If we lose our emotional control, then the players think that's okay too. So we should hold ourselves to the standard that we want from the players. And if we don't, then we can't be surprised, or we shouldn't feel let down when the players drop their standards as well.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously the holding yourself to high standards as a leader definitely directly translates to your team, and just leading by example, in addition to kind of like what you communicated with them. And you talked about the collaborative effort. And I think that getting people to buy into your vision and accepting those roles, I mean, these are things that traditional sports teams struggle with, right? Just kind of everybody being very high level in terms of the talent. And then when you step up or enter into a new situation, sometimes you might be that backup player. Sometimes you might be that role player, and accepting those roles can be difficult. I love the story with the chef, because if you're in the right environment and everybody is part of the team, then like you
Yeah.
said, there's kind of no barriers, right? There's no lines of, oh well, this person knows what they're talking about and this person doesn't. It's all gathering information, and it's important information to help you as a team reach your highest level.
Yeah, my favorite coach is actually Sir Alex Ferguson. So his books they're a gold mine, and I like that when he was for Manchester United, he knew everyone's name, from the tea lady to the boot man to the waitresses, everything, and he would always say good morning, hey, and call them by name. And I think like that's the kind of thing where it makes you feel included, it makes you feel you're important, because this is coming from the main guy at the club, and he'll stop and have a chat. Nothing's more important than, I guess, like that person and the job that they do for the team, because there's no small job. They're all important. And I really like that. I think like that's something that sometimes when you get the label, when you get the moniker, when you get like, oh, I'm head coach, I am this person, that you feel like you're better than someone else. But the whole, I guess, like team falls apart if people stop doing their job, even the small ones, because who's going to do it at that point, right? Like it's kind of a well-oiled machine. And like what you mentioned about roles, I think is important. And I had a question. So in esports, the player base is smaller, in terms of like professional player base. We would struggle, let's say, with culture versus skill. Where do you stand on, okay, I'm going to have to sacrifice culture here because this guy doesn't believe in what we do, but he's the best player in the role. We're going to bring him in. And then the effect that has on everyone else, because I've seen it myself in esports, but I'm just curious from your experience in esports as well and traditional sports, like the big difference there. And like, would you sacrifice if you were a coach of an esports team?
Great question. For me personally, culture is the most important thing, and driving that culture in everything that you do is really at the forefront of everything that is happening within the building, everything that you are creating in terms of the environment. Just because you have a talented player or the MVP of the league on your team doesn't mean that every decision that you make is geared towards this one person. What if this person decides they don't want to practice this week? And everybody else has to practice, but we're still going to he's the MVP, right? He can do that. Like, give him his time. If that person isn't fully bought into the culture, in my mind, that's going to be a problem, because like, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about like being good? Are we talking about getting sponsorship deals or having the MVP on our team? Or are we talking about winning championships? Are we talking about performing at our highest level? And I think you see this in some of the really good traditional sports teams where, yeah, there's guys, and I'm picking James Harden just kind of like off the top of my
Yep.
head, who's this like really talented basketball player. There's no question he's a Hall of Fame basketball player, but there is kind of this level where he's never really been able to elevate his team. I don't want to just like point to the way things ended with his time in Houston as like indicative of him, but like, are we just kind of like doing whatever we can to like make this person happy, which by some accounts was probably happening in Houston with James Harden?
Yeah.
Or, do we want a guy like Damian Lillard, who, he had a really great interview after his game last week. We're here in March 2021. He went off in the fourth quarter, and they're asking him after the game, and he's like, I'm all about that work. Like nobody gave me a chance coming out of high school. Nobody gave me a chance coming out of college. Nobody gave me a chance being on a pro team. And like, I've always been about the work, and I'm not going to change that. Well, like I would much rather have a guy like that as the leader of my team. And I know that's kind of a perfect situation in terms of like Damian Lillard. But for me, like my standards are so high that everything is about winning a championship. Everything is about us as a team playing at our highest level, not making sure that we have the MVP on our roster.
Yeah, I can agree with all of that. I think for esports and for traditional sports, like culture is important, but you have to kind of know what your values are, what your priorities are, in order to have a culture. So if your culture changes year to year based off of what roster you have, is it really a culture, or is it just something that's like a smorgasbord of different values from different people based off of like what you brought in? You actually might be able to even like clarify. Like I heard a rumor that the Patriots were so strong in their culture and the things they wanted to do that there would be like exceptional players that said, no, I'm not going there because I can't do what's expected of me there, or I don't think I'd like it there. It's like, it's too tough. So they kind of like, they probably spoke to Bill Belichick and they're like, okay, yeah, thanks for the offer. Thanks for the talk, but I'm going to go somewhere else, because of the fact that what was demanded of them was either so high or so different from what they wanted or what they did before.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could go off here. It's really interesting. First of all, one of the important pieces, and I don't want to make this about Tom Brady, but Tom Brady and the other leaders on that team really kind of are responsible for a lot of the success that they had over 20 years. And I know that's obvious, and that sounds like I'm talking about them on the field, but I'm not. I'm talking about them in the locker room. One thing in particular that stands out is, if you're familiar, like Bill Belichick, obviously old school coach, very demanding, and also attacks problems. In other words, like when he's in the team meeting setting, Tom Brady is not hands off. Like you cannot criticize him because he's the best player in the league. Tom Brady is probably criticized more in those team meetings than anybody in that room. Now that has a huge effect, right? Like if the younger players that maybe haven't been there for the past championships see Tom Brady getting yelled at and the head coach questioning whether he can make a 10-yard out route throw, what's going to happen to me when I miss my block on the kickoff team? So I better like run down and get my block. That has a huge effect on the team. But also you have to have players that are willing to be coached hard. And the really great players want to be coached hard. They want to be held accountable. They crave that discipline. You look at someone like Tim Duncan, who is, one of the best players of all time. He coaches with a very similar type of coach in terms of the demanding style in Greg Popovich. And, it's interesting. In one of my experiences working with esports teams, I had a coach that referenced, well, I really look up to Greg Popovich. He's able to yell at Tim Duncan. And I kind of had to just take a step back and explain, number one, Tim Duncan is a veteran professional player who is allowing Greg Popovich to coach him a certain way, who craves that type of coaching. But then also there is the relationship aspect. And I know we just talked about this, but, I remember reading a story about Greg Popovich when Tim Duncan I think he was about to be drafted number 1 overall. And Greg Popovich flew to the Virgin Islands where Tim Duncan's family was, and literally like spent 2 weeks in the Virgin Islands, like hanging out with the family, getting to know them. So when he's yelling at him 15, 20 years later, they have an entire relationship built on honesty and trust and holding each other accountable and wanting what's best for each other. And that care and that relationship is the basis of everything that you see. And maybe there is that in New England, or maybe it's maybe on a maybe more specific level of just like the honesty and like, hey, we're all here to do our job, and I'm going to hold you accountable to doing your job. But I think there's some truth to that. Some players are not cut out for that. they do not want that type of coaching. And I think this also changes in terms of sports too. I just mentioned James Harden. Like, listen, the reality of basketball, and I think maybe esports has a little of this as well, is that like you need one of the best players on your team, like to be, you need the best player on your team to be one of the best players in the league to have even a shot of being competitive.
Yeah.
And that is the reality of the situation. And you can't just make every decision and say, well, we're just going to bring in the highest character guys if they can't if they can't compete at that level. So I think you have to have a filtering system, and you have to kind of, like you said, identify what are your values, what are you looking for in players, and kind of do they match that. So to go back to your original question, I'm obviously going off on tangents here, but I do think that there are some players that see that, and that's not really what they're about. They're probably not really about winning championships. They're probably about their money. They're probably about, being a star, being a part of that culture that, let's be honest, is not really a star driven culture. The Patriots culture is kind of this team culture for sure. Probably a lot of players were turned off by that. And that's also good, right? They're not going to fit well in that culture anyway. And this goes back to like the honesty piece, which is like, be honest about what you expect from players, so that when they get into those situations, like everything has already been addressed. Like we talked about what this was going to be like.
Yeah, I think like for Patriots, they're a great example of culture in American football. The All Blacks similarly in rugby as well. And I think because they've had such a steady stream of success aligned with their culture for so long, like it hasn't changed even as the players have come and gone, that you already know what you're getting yourself in for before you play your first game for the Patriots or get your first cap for the All Blacks. You kind of know what it's for, a decent idea of what it's about, because everyone knows about it. The players speak about it all the time. They speak about it like every chance they get, and people kind of know that it's a specific way of, let's say, how you speak, how you act, everything like this. And it's kind of in every walk of life. Similar one to, like, let's say Brady kind of getting criticized by Belichick and him allowing it to happen. Same with Popovich and Duncan. Like, the relationship is super important there, because the more trust you have with the coach or the player, the more respect you have, the harder you can go. If you just met someone for the first time and he's your player and you go really ham on him, he just might say like, who the hell is this guy? Like, you're my coach in name, but you're a douche. Like, I don't really understand why you're doing this. But if you have a really strong relationship, you can go super hard on someone and there's no hard feelings. Bygones be bygones. And I think that's the real test of a coach, is like, how do you build a relationship with someone that maybe is just arriving in the team for the first time, or maybe you don't know anything about, or maybe he's, got a slightly disillusioned. Maybe he's like, got dropped from his previous team. Like, how do you get inside this guy's head so that you can figure out how you can drive him, how you can, I guess, like, support him as well in what he's doing? And it's different because every time you bring in a player, esports, for example, 5 players in a League of Legends team, 20% of your culture from the players is one player. So if you bring in, one kind of lazy player, doesn't like to work hard, and you bring in 4 hardworking players, suddenly you've got to either try convince that one player that working hard is really important and why you should do it, or that guy stands out like a sore thumb. Like, the other 4 guys are working hard, this guy's slacking off a little bit early, and you have to find some way of justifying results, especially if they're going poorly. It's like, well, yeah, this guy doesn't want to work hard and I can't change his mind, right? So you kind of have to know what you're getting yourself in for. So like the example of knowing what the culture is before you even go in, I think is like, it's super key, because there are players that will be like, I want that, even before they get tapped up or before they get like someone flies to the islands to go talk to you, the coach. You already know that this is what you want to do, and you can kind of set up your stall that way, right? You can kind of like talk about it and be like, yeah, this is, I want to play for the All Blacks. I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to play for Manchester United. Like, this is my boyhood club. Happens a lot in soccer. But I think like in esports as well, just bringing it back to this, there are certain teams that have a specific culture and it's been strong for years and years. And then there are teams where, if I don't know what you stand for or what your values are for the last like few years, or just from the outside looking in, they're probably not strong enough. They're probably not, let's say, visceral enough in order for even players to latch onto, because I kind of know what Team Liquid are about. I kind of know what TSM are about. I kind of know what Cloud9 are about. Like the most successful teams have these cultures where you kind of look in and go, yeah, I can see what they're trying to do here. I can see what they value here, because from interviews, from articles, from how they hold themselves, you can kind of see what they're going for. But there are certain teams where it changes about as much as their rosters change, which is the main point I think I'm getting at. If you want stability in culture, you need stability in personnel as well.
Yeah. And you hit it on the head when you talked about knowing what you stand for and knowing what you want, knowing what your values are. Just to kind of wrap up on the Patriots, you think about Bill Belichick going into that situation. Drew Bledsoe was the quarterback at the time, the starting quarterback. He was the highest paid player in the history of the NFL. He had just signed $100 million contract. And they had basically identified that when Bill Belichick got there, that he did not really stand for the culture that was trying to be built. And I think this is a really underrated piece, but yet it's crucial, is that your best player has to be representative of the culture you're trying to build. Yep. If you are going to build this championship culture. And you see this time and time again. Sam Walker's book, The Captain Class, kind of outlines this.
I read that last month. It's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, it's a great book, and kind of alludes to what we were talking about a moment ago with Tim Duncan and Tom Brady. And they're really the catalyst for the culture. And I remember a friend of mine who worked for who played for the Patriots. They had acquired a player named Rodney Harrison. And Rodney Harrison, kind of like this hard-hitting safety, but he had kind of an attitude problem. He had been an all-pro player, and he had been cut. And then he was, like you said, he was kind of like in free agency talking to Bill Belichick. I don't know if he had a ton of offers, but he ends up signing with the Patriots. And I remember my friend that worked there, or that played there, he was describing how Rodney Harrison would get so wound up for practice that while the offense was doing was going through their plays, and the top defensive guys would be kind of like on the sideline sitting, drinking water, waiting for their turn to kind of like run on the field and do their plays. Rodney Harrison would go behind the huddle, the offensive huddle, and he would start running sprints. And like when that first started happening, everybody was like, what is going on? What is this guy doing? Yeah. And he was just like so wound up. He had so much energy that he just started running wind sprints literally during practice when he was supposed to be on the sideline resting. Yeah. And then a week later, he was doing it. And then like a couple of other defensive backs joined him. And then it got to the point where when the offense was running their plays versus the scout defense, the entire first team defense is behind the offense running wind sprints during their rest period in practice. And so like, it's things like that are I'm not saying that's why they won championships, but it's like that work ethic, that mentality just slowly starts to permeate. And it starts at the very top with the leadership, whether that's the coach or the player or a combination of them or the player buying into the coach. And then it just slowly starts to come down. And this all goes back to team building, right? Like knowing what you want, knowing what your team is going to look like if it's performing at the highest level. And I think this is often overlooked because we look at talent and we're like, man, we have a chance to get a guy like James Harden, again, just kind of using him as kind of like the poster here. But it's like, is he truly representative of like what you want? He's a good player. He's going to help you win games, but we're not here to win games. We're here to win championships. We're here to build a sustained system of greatness. And I think that's sometimes overlooked and needs to be at the core of your team building, is kind of like knowing what you want and going and finding players that emulate that.
Yeah, I think like the whole winning games versus winning championships, I think a lot of people fall into well, you can't win championships without winning games, but you're going to win games if you have good players, no doubt about it. But you're also going to struggle in the games that, go into overtime, that are close, that are like towards the end of the season. And what if things don't go well? like you got to make sure that the players you have aren't just fair weather players that just play well when the cameras are on, that only play well when you have crowds watching them, right? And I think like it's it's so hard. And like going back to the captain's class as well, like what I found most interesting about that is that the people that were driving culture weren't the flashy guys who were scoring the goals and scoring all the points. They were the guys who put in all the hard work, that were doing the wind sprints, that were helping people with luggage, that were doing all the hard running. That they were the guys that were setting the culture, because they were like they were consistent. They had morals and values that didn't waver no matter what happened, even if they were winning or losing. My favorite example is Puyol for Barcelona. Uh, at the time, he was surrounded by extremely talented players from around the world, and full of flair, full of creativity. Some of them were like Brazilian, and when they celebrate, they dance, and they're dancing away. And I remember, I think it was against Malaga or something. They were like 6-0 up. They were like smashing Malaga, and the players started doing like dancing together. And he just went over to them, like didn't scold them, but he's kind of like, come on, let's go. Enough of this kind of a thing, His day job was winning soccer games. It's the same for Roy Keane as well. And I think like that kind of a person that will make sure that you don't drop your standards, because he never drops his, is super key, because it's like a double-edged sword. Sometimes you have James Harden, sometimes you have other players that are like really talented, but there's like a dark side to them, or a gray side, that maybe they don't work so hard, maybe they kind of give up a little bit too early, maybe they don't put in the defensive work, right? That kind of a thing. And then the guys that are always on the front line, they're the ones that will keep them honest, and uh, it's an underrated job, honestly. I think like even see it in esports, you see it in other sports as well, where this person doesn't have crazy stats, they're not like lighting the world on fire, and yet people speak like with such high praise about them and the things they do. But a lot of the people don't see it, because we only see the match day, right? All the grunt work. They jump in head first, get the ball, give it off to the really talented player, and that's their job. It's the dirty work. And I feel like the reason that all these players talk about how good these players were before is because they're working with them 99% of the time in practice, outside of the game, and they see what kind of a person they're like. And people have to trust that if a professional player says that their teammate is like invaluable or indispensable, that there's a reason for it, just because you can't see it.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier that I just want to like go back to and hit on, and it's really in line with what we're discussing, which is kind of, it's not necessarily all the coach creating that culture, and it's not necessarily having that player. It's kind of a combination of a lot of things. And one of the things I've been really researching a lot and looking into is like the environment dictating the success or maybe the failure of some really talented players, and just kind of like being a part of a certain type of culture. And I kind of think I look at the Golden State Warriors, and they were a really good team. They were kind of like building up, becoming a playoff team under their previous coach, Mark Jackson. And then Steve Kerr gets there, and it was kind of, a confluence of a lot of things. They're obviously really talented. But I remember I was listening to Steve Kerr kind of talk about his core values and how he developed his core values and kind of implemented them on the team. And, Steve Kerr's a really interesting guy to look at too, because of his background. Coach played under Lute Olson, played under Phil Jackson, played under Greg Popovich. It's literally like, a Hall of Fame collection of coaches that he learned from firsthand as a player. On top of playing with really great players. And one of the core values in his system at Golden State is joy. And in talking about how he wanted joy to be a core value, he was talking about how amazing it is to have a great player, your best player, literally the model for your core values. And so he was talking about how Steph Curry is just this joyous player. And you really do, especially over the last like 5 years, you see it. Like you can hate Kevin Durant for going to play with the Warriors when he's like the second best player in the league. But like you can see it. Like, how can you not want to play with those guys? It looks like so much fun. And I think, this is kind of like a confluence of multiple things. It's like creating the right environment for those players to thrive in, but who's going to thrive in those environments? It's going to be the players that really kind of are very much aligned with the core values of the organization. So, I mean, I could go off on this, and I just think it's a really interesting piece in terms of the team building and setting the vision and like looking for exactly those things in the players. And I'm curious from your experience, Robert, just seeing like building culture, like what has esports gotten right about building culture? And then maybe what are some of the things they've gotten wrong?
That's a good question. I watched a video on YouTube about Steph Curry, I think at the All-Star game, and he was just like dancing and like talking with people. He was like a kid who won a ticket to play at the All-Star game. And although someone who's very, very good at basketball, but it was just fun to see how happy he was, like maybe there would have been players who was like, oh man, I got to go to an All-Star game. Or maybe they're a little bit like jaded. It's like another one of these, this is my fourth one kind of a thing. But he was just like super happy. And you can't say joy is one of your tenets of culture, and then bring in people who are like somber and miserable and don't really highlight or showcase what joy is. And obviously, if you said joy to all the NBA teams, they might take it as something different. They might have different ways of like facilitating that, of bringing it up and helping players kind of like really live it. So I think like you said, he worked under so many good coaches that he's just like, okay, this is what I believe is really important. And then he started bringing in people that not didn't just believe in it, but lived it, right? You can't just bring in someone and go, that sounds really interesting, I'm going to try that myself. That joy sounds awesome. How do I do it exactly? Like, what do I have to do? It's less of a join the dots blueprint framework and more of a like, I'm just joyous. I love basketball and I love life, right? And I think he got that one. And I think whatever your culture is, as long as you bring in the right people, you can't go wrong, because it's your culture, it's your vision. And like esports, what have we got right? I think, not to say that we haven't got anything right. I'm just thinking like something really that stands out to me.
And maybe it's still, I mean, like, let's be honest, it's still pretty early in terms of like building a lot of this stuff out. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed in my work with esports organizations is like, there is no Bill Belichick. There is no coach that's been here for 30 years that you can learn from. I mean, you're kind of having to take the Greg Popovich, the Bill Belichick's of the world and kind of mold them to esports. And it's not always going to be a perfect, just like pick up this mold and place it down. I mean, I noticed that very early on in my work, where I was working with different personalities. I was working with people that didn't have a ton of experience. So I had to like change my coaching style, because I can't go in there and just tell football stories every single time. I have to relate it to them.
I would love that personally, but yeah.
And maybe this is kind of like it's part of the growing of esports. You kind of mentioned that originally it was just players, then they incorporated coaches. These are coaches that are still former players. There's not a lot of background necessarily in terms of the education. So maybe that's a more interesting thing to like dig into, is just kind of like, how do we develop these leaders that are coming as former players that maybe don't have the background necessarily of some of the traditional sports coaches?
Before we jump in, I think the thing they've done pretty well in esports is bringing in people with, I guess, different backgrounds, trying to figure out like what works and what doesn't work. So we've had a lot of different representatives from traditional sports, psychology, counseling, behavioral analysis. We've brought them into esports, and we've had different levels of success with these guys, right? And I think we're pretty open to bringing in new ideas, outside ideas into esports, and trying to incorporate that into the team. The other side of the coin for this is that I don't feel like these people have been given enough time. It's very disingenuous to say that this person failed when they've only had 6 months or a year, and then you change everything after that. Because sometimes you have your season, you finish 8th place, and you're like, okay, we'll make a few changes, nothing crazy, and then we'll go into the next season with these kind of deliberate changes in line, instead of just going, okay, change all 5 players, change coaching staff, change everything, and then it's like reshuffling the deck. Sometimes a broken clock is right twice a day. So sometimes they will be successful. Like, we did it, we finally got it. But the proof is in how consistent you are with your success. And if you can see, or if I can see that changes are being made like deliberately, instead of kind of, oh well, we lost this game, so changes have to be made. I really enjoy looking at teams that don't make a change, because I know that, okay, they see something. They have trust in the roadmap to success, or the plan that they have going forward. And I can see that, like, winning and losing, the outcome itself isn't going to change what decisions they make, because you've already decided, like, hey, if we win this game, great. If we don't, that's fine too. We have a plan going for next year. Uh, Leadership and whatnot, like, we don't have a Bill Belichick. And to steal a quote from Batman, you either die the hero or live long enough to become the villain. Like, in traditional sports, it's really easy for coaches to be like, and I read the oh, what's the book called again? I'll get back to it. But basically, like, they kind of went through where a season was a footnote. They're like, well, this season happened and we didn't have enough experience in our team, so it wasn't successful. Like, that was their chapter for a season, like from a book. I'm like, you just brushed over it so easily. And it's because it's easy, because these coaches have 10, 20, 30 years behind them, right? That you can't just invest and live in like one season only, right? It just happens. Sometimes you can explain it. But in esports, we have coaches who have been coaching for maybe max 5 years, maybe, like, properly. That's not a lot of time. That's, you're still a crazy rookie coach. But these guys have been coaching almost at the top level of esports for that amount of time. And what I said about, let's say, or live long enough to become the villain, we had a coach who was seen as the best coach in the West, and he had a bit of a rut, and then he got out of it, and they're like, oh my god, this guy's actually so good, and the team was doing so well, and then they kind of like capitulated at the end. Maybe they had 2 months where they played poorly, and they didn't qualify for Worlds when they were probably the best team for 90% of the season. And then he was let go, and it could have been for a myriad of reasons. But for the most part, his kind of stock dropped. It plummeted. You're like, okay, you're fired now because you had a bad 2 months out of 5 years. And I'm thinking, that's kind of rough as a coach, you know? Your stock and your worth and your whatever shouldn't change based off of, a bad, quarter of a season out of many. And I think in esports, that's the part that we get wrong, is that we don't give people enough time, because if you're always on edge, if your job is always on the line because of winning and losing, then it's no life to be living in, right? It is a results-based industry, but at the same time, you have to trust the process. You can't just be like, okay, if we win this, everyone's going to keep their job because we're going to be in playoffs. Everyone's going to have a contract for next year. But if we lose it, we're going to make changes. That's essentially what they're saying. And that's essentially the vibe that, like, I've been on teams where players are worried about their job for the following year, even though they're under contract, because they know that their contracts don't really mean much. They'll just get canceled. So they're like, we have to win. We have to win. I have to look good. I have to perform well. And sometimes individual players performing well doesn't align with the team winning. Sometimes it's just looking good, like just making sure you play all the easy passes and like making sure your stats are good, that kind of a thing. And that's dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, I 100% agree. And, it kind of goes back to, you were talking about like that consistency and, to judge somebody off of, a star player gets hurt or has to sit out a certain amount of time. This is the rough part about coaching, is that you can be top level NFL coach and then you get fired and nobody wants to hire you. And now you're at the lower levels of college football. And it's kind of crazy when you start looking at it and you're like, like, do these teams actually understand why they win and why they lose? Or are they just making decisions like emotionally in the moment? So we'll kind of shelve that tangent for our next conversation. But Robert, I really appreciate you joining me. And I want to just wrap up. I know you and I we're kind of book nerds and we're always kind of sharing different types of resources. So you had kind of mentioned Alex Ferguson's book earlier on. And, I know that you're a voracious reader. So just want to hear from you. Is there any type of resources that you would recommend or that maybe you've been digging into or maybe wanting to dig into recently?
As of yet, I'm hitting my research books. I'm reading articles and journals because I'm studying right now. I haven't had a chance to sit down with a book for a while. Uh, for like travel reading, because I'm doing some traveling now. Like I get the Harvard Business Review. Like you get this little like synopsis of different like mini books that have like little takes or best of from their research papers, which I think is like really easy to read because it's a pretty thin book and it covers like, let's say, mental toughness to communication to emotional intelligence or emotional control. And I think like if you're looking for specific topics that you're interested in, like picking up this, it gives you like a kind of a sampling or variety of like different topics that I think are very digestible.
Yes, I will back that 100%. I've read some of those and really quality stuff.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, Robert, dude, thank you so much for joining me here today, and safe travels back to the U.S. and look forward to chatting with you soon, man.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Nice talking to you, man.